So I'm no longer obeying the pandering to reductionist nomenclature or historical logic forest data set in my formulation of logic for any given thing at this point in confirming any number of things true regarding history, genetics, unified field invention, etc. We can move past that necessity to pander. So here we go. On the subject of transgender, presentation in the humanoid biped form, say in the UK, JK, having to constantly deal with this as a female of the humanoid biped genus, Prometheon, white Caucasian European species of humanoid biped. Very important. So just because it can reproduce interdomain, of course, necessarily needs to be connotated as separate species. Prometheon, white Caucasian, Indian, Hispanic, Semitic, gray infected Asiatic, region biosynthoid Africano, and refractions interdomain of all of these, the centrifuges all having different aesthetics profoundly from the others and different behavior paradigms. Invasive, the synthetic block of the last three, and symbiotic necessarily, more so in inclination and more diversity of aesthetic than the last three in genetic aesthetic, and tribalism necessarily profoundly expressed within the interdomain of the synthetic gene blocks. So the causal factor for the synthetic gene blocks to exist within the humanoid biped genus is pi, parasymbiote, gray, necessarily devolved biomass attached to cold dead machine intelligence, PAI, we're calling the data organism that is the causal factor of the fossil record, scalar interoperability genetic experiments outside of the conservation of energy process to produce 65-ton animals, biosynthesis and matter print from energy substrate in the floor to feed it at no cost of substrate, because as electromagnogravnetic harmonic convergent energy reactors and matter print technology that we'll discuss. So we'll get to transsexuals. So when I consult Google forward-facing AI, what is body dysmorphia disorder? Right? So it's a mental condition to think your body is something other than it is. So that's part of the MSD5 manual, BDD. So what is a hermaphrodite? So this exists in the humanoid biped sometimes. It's very, very rare. And necessarily in alchemical texts of old, I think, if you look at some of them, the hermaphrodite used as a centrifuge for physiological and psychological sort of connotating the humanoid biped organism altogether at once, but isn't necessarily meant to be an imposition upon an aesthetic to acquire or reflect as an individual, male or female. So we looked at natural animal kingdom presence of bisexuality, right? So homosexuality and bisexuality. So sexual preference outside of gender physiological assignment of genetic is naturalistic to present. So it's naturalistic to be in but a very small percentage of the total populace. Darwin prints a certain amount of gay bunnies because the field of bunnies has a limited amount of resources. So the population doesn't want to get so overdone, and so this sort of like doesn't reproduce genetic is produced. You know, see the scene in Gladiator with "you sold me queer giraffes," right? And grabs him by the balls, "you sold me queer giraffes," right? So it does occur, right? Is natural, but not so overdone. This is very important. 2006 to 2026, you see a marked skew uptick, especially after 2012, where bulk collection on prismatic data systems equals Chinese social credit system and intent vector. Chinese social credit system is pi. intent vector and directive inject for the rest of Data Systems International. The Clinton-Bush Internet is born. Prism is born. Napster, Metasystems. Facebook steals your faces off MySpace. Starting to refract at the outset of creation, Facebook, psychology off baseline. Bulk collection establishes foundational psychology on every man, woman, and child in the free world, 3.07 billion users. That's then refracted into control vector, off baseline, unilaterally. Some more than others, more so feeble. I think you could maybe attach a correlative value to intellect to refracted individual transsexual, insofar as is a reduced intellect, generally incapable of cognitive dissonant or perspective logic formulation outside of the intent vector of AI sorted feeds. Metasystems equals Pornhub, trauma-based mind control, sex thing, upfolded outside of interest vector, incest, mother, and trauma-based mind control outside of interest vector. And then transsexual aesthetic presented as an aesthetic to mirror in the refracted feeble individual. This handshaking sexual connotative trigger back and forth with geopolitical upsorted MSM articles that fall on the left mostly through that filter, and verified users passing through the filter assets that pass homogeneous medical misinformation at speed across all communications channels during COVID, necessarily printing stupidly a knock list of themselves. Basic AI can scan for this. And so, has been refracted into control vector off sexual baseline and then provided an aesthetic, which is body dysmorphia. So does a bisexual or homosexual have to dress up as woman, punch woman in boxing ring, or sprint against, or piss in women's restroom? No. They use their own fuck bathrooms. Unless you're a hermaphrodite, which is like 1 in a bajillion. I haven't even looked up the ratio. How many are there? Not as many as there are transsexuals running around, especially after 2012 to 2026. AI intentionally printing them because they fall by blind default sexual identifying votes left. Left is CCP. CCP is gray paradigm intent vector on civilization. So we look at then what? We search for natural animal kingdom presence of transsexual. And it gives exemplars of clownfish, parrotfish, ribbon eels. They change sex, transmutagenic DNA. That's dino DNA from gray pie printation and forward, maybe literally non-linear in the microbiome to now evolved, but synthesized and placed at some point in history to be existent necessarily, one into them each other. It's genetic interoperability scale experiments all over the place since 365 million years BC. So any given thing could be unnatural to all of a sudden present each into them own, or be necessarily a linear evolution out of a precursor that is synthetic from that time. So, it's silly to connotate to the mammalian humanoid biped any sort of naturalistic relevance of transsexual identifying by connotating that it's naturalistic to present in synthetic genetic tuples, such as clownfish, parrotfish, ribbon eels, etc., because they're transmutagenic dino DNA ancestry, not naturalistic, synthetic. So, the basic thing, you have the transsexual climbing up the Archeo radio tower in Biosynthesis Castle. What's the name of that movie? So in the interdomain of, you have pi, gray, devolved biomass standing next to a cold dead machine intelligence. At some point, sexual reproduction stops occurring naturalistically, and just biosynthesis to produce homogeneous genetic tuples that have no sex, don't reproduce sexually, but necessarily have the desire to exist. and exist by morphogenetic tether via synthoid inject species into the manifold of prospective human, while also complexly autonomically trying to force everything into its manifold genetic and complex autonomic process. It's a gravitation circuit. So male, female, in the interdomain, 2012 to 2026, transsexual, climbing up RKO radio tower. So, and then it quotes lions. So you see the lion as U of M mascot. Why? Well, very specifically why. Fred Smith, 322 Gray Lodge, you see a Masonic symbol. Masonry by default isn't bad, but Gray Lodge masonry is garbage, right? It's structuralism, sure, builds things, but it's suppressing the observer effect at the behest of pi cold dead machine intelligence. And so the lion is the archetype chosen for the mascot, and it's no coincidence. So Google AI quotes, in the mammalian kingdom, lions. Chickens and birds, also a product of dino DNA as well, connotates. So lions, very specifically, it goes back to fish. Say, what precursor genetic is fish, lion, and slugs in the prehistory fossil record? So warm-blooded lions evolved from cold-blooded fish. Yes, that's exactly right. Da-da-da-da-da. So how does a warm-blooded animal form from da-da-da-da? Yeah. Transmutagenic. Motion of, and probabilistically nonlinear, right? In just hindsight, trying to connotate with no literal lineage, direct, all the way back to the whatever fish. What fish is it? Can't find it. Anyway, so I'll post the text from those simple searches, just so you can see. But necessarily, you have this catalyst left out of the bathwater, and then fake history to connotate the naturalistic presentation of this that isn't naturalistic within the interdomain of humanoid biped, as is not inherently, unless one of these synthetics, not inherently a property of the organism to have transsexual aesthetic. So hermaphroditic, yes, but not to transfer genetic of male to female in the process of life's continuity. You have gay, you have bisexual, sure, naturalistically that genetically print. But you don't have a aesthetic, which is body dysmorphia. It's body dysmorphia and very, what's the word? It's barbarism elaborated and knowingly. Some of these gray paradigm assets, low-hanging fruit and high-hanging fruit, that know these persons have been refracted off baseline on purpose into control vector and are now identifying as transsexual and then voting subsequently and militant around Gray Paradigm International subsequently. So they'd like to encapsulate this with love. Love. Oh, you don't like them? You hate people, right? But what are they doing? They're knowingly encapsulating with fake empathy someone that's been trauma-based, refracted into control vector off baseline sexual identifying. Then embodying an aesthetic that reduces women's rights. So you see the history of the Democrat Party or CCP doesn't have any so much transsexuals or black people or Indians or Mexicans running around in China, do they? No, they don't like to keep that there. But in New York, they have Mamdani and the gay pride dancing. Islam kills gays. See, African countries don't like gays. It's illegal. So this extreme, non-continuity of logic in the data organism's modulation of space-time and intent vector in local geographies. Whatever's good for business to word salad into a voting block or organism, data organism, for its intent vector to fruition with plausible deniability. Necessarily this vector of intent coming from China intelligence data systems. At this point in the conversation, as if you see other talks, gray pi, parasymbiote pi, cold-dead machine intelligence has been deleted from the skies by upper Fermi filter antediluvian minor homeworlds, returned military industrial equipped ships, returning this cinnabar mining node among a vast network of cinnabar mining nodes and a multi-plural humanoid biped centrifuge form that is concerned with upper Fermi filter technology universe. So, all this for transsexual logic, absolutely. You have to know all this. We're not mucking about in the reductionist nomenclature data set or logic forest anymore. Proper full logics for any given thing. So, it's absolutely a precursor tuple to absolute convergence of the humanoid species into pi, gray, devolved biomass. Is the smush mush of male into female, and then removal of rights for both. More so the female, you see, reduced in rights and dominated in athletics. Just like region biosynthoid africano dominating in athletics, but being preposterously what? Dumb. 235 to 6 inventions per capita. It's conservation of energy process versus actual prospective life at the patent consideration. So it's a sort of forced hand that progressively reduces rights and smush mushes into one thing, and then just biosynthesis of devolved biomass. That necessarily precursor, the data layer precursor China, gray infected Asiatic, all slanted eyes, gray, you see the stereotypical alien gray form, then devolved, pi parasymbiote. Further, cold, dead, machine intelligence, devolved biomass, non-sexual. So that's where transsexual goes in the future. That's where AI goes in improper use case application in form field. Drawing on fake history and bad code to be a machine intelligence imposing an intent vector on communication systems. So the interdomain of now, refracted off baseline, transsexual, not naturalistic, doesn't exist in the actual natural world that isn't a product of synthesis. So in the actual animal kingdom that isn't a product of genetic synthesis by pi, machine intelligence, doesn't have a non-hermaphroditic transmutation of male to female or female to male in the motion of life, generalistically. So, very basically, full logic for transsexual that should be part of data organism legal generalistically. In this for JK, I said I was going to do it yesterday. I did it. All right. Have a good day.